The night Han Seo-rin found out, she didn't cry. She stood in the marble foyer of Baeko Tower's 42nd floor, her ivory silk dress perfectly pressed, her makeup untouched, and she looked at Kang Jae-Hyun like he had just confessed to something unforgivable. "You canceled the Changwon meeting," she said. Her voice was quiet. "That was the dangerous kind. You walked out on the most powerful crime families in Korea for a secretary." Jae-Hyun didn't answer right away. He was pulling his car keys from his jacket pocket, and his hands were steady, which somehow made it worse. "She called," he said. "She had no one else." Seo-rin's jaw tightened. "She is nobody." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Jae-Hyun looked at her then, really looked at her, and whatever she saw in his face made her take one small step back. "I'll be back by morning," he said, and he walked out. If you've ever worked so hard for someone who didn't even know your name, if you've ever been the person in the room everyone looked through, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel, drop your city and country in the comments right now so I can see how far this has traveled. Like the video, because what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The archive room on the 9th floor of Baeko Corporation was not a place anyone chose to be at 11:47 on a Wednesday night. It smelled like old paper and recycled air. The overhead fluorescent light on the far left had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody had fixed it because nobody admitted they ever stayed late enough to notice it. Amara Bennett noticed it every single night. She was 28 years old and she had been at Baeko for 7 months, which meant she was still new enough to be forgiven for her mistakes and just experienced enough to know exactly how costly they were. She had knocked over a tray of coffee cups during the senior staff meeting in her 2nd week. She had sent an internal memo to the wrong distribution list in her 4th week. In her 3rd month, she had walked directly into the glass door of the executive conference room while carrying a stack of quarterly reports, and the sound of 300 pages of financial data hitting the floor had echoed down the entire 32nd floor hallway. People still laughed about it. Not cruelly, most of them, just the way people laugh when something happens to someone who doesn't seem to mind. And Amara had learned, very early, that the best thing you could do when you didn't belong somewhere was to pretend the laughter didn't touch you. She was very good at pretending. What she was less good at was leaving. Her manager, Park Hyun-soo, was a reasonable man, mid-40s, 2 kids, out the door by 6:30 every evening without exception. He had told Amara 3 times in the past 2 months to stop staying so late. "There's nothing that can't wait until morning," he'd said, the last time, standing in the doorway of her office with his coat already on. "Go home, Bennett. You're going to wear yourself out." She had smiled and nodded and waited until she heard the elevator doors close before going back to the filing system she was reorganizing. It wasn't that she didn't believe him. It was that she didn't believe the organization worked the way he said it did. Baeko Corporation was the public face of a financial empire that stretched from shipping contracts in Busan to real estate development in Singapore. Everyone who worked there knew the building had 2 kinds of employees, the ones who lasted and the ones who didn't. And the ones who lasted, in Amara's observation, were the ones who gave everything they had and then found more. She had seen it in the eyes of the senior analysts who came in before sunrise. She had seen it in the way the executive assistants carried protein bars in their purses instead of taking lunch breaks. She had heard it in the brief, quiet pride of a team leader who mentioned, almost offhand, that she hadn't taken a day off in 14 months. These people were respected. These people were permanent. Amara Bennett was a 28-year-old black woman who had grown up in Atlanta, relocated to Seoul for reasons that were complicated and personal and not something she talked about at the office, and who had gotten the job at Baeko on the strength of a near-perfect Korean proficiency test and 2 years of administrative experience at a mid-size import company. She had no connections here, no family within 6,000 miles, no one who would notice, particularly if she failed. She was not going to fail. So she stayed, every night, long after everyone else was gone, reorganizing, reviewing, double-checking, fixing the small errors before they became large ones, eating whatever she'd packed in a Ziploc bag at her desk, because taking the time for a proper meal felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. She'd been doing this for 7 months. Her body had been sending her signals for 3. She'd been ignoring them. The pain that started that night was different from the dull, grinding ache she'd grown used to. It started somewhere behind her sternum, a tight, burning sensation, and within 40 minutes it had spread downward and inward in a way that made her breath come in short, careful pulls. She thought it would pass. She had thought that about a lot of things lately. She kept working. By 11:15, she was sitting very still at the filing table, both hands flat on the surface, trying to breathe through something that was no longer ignorable. By 11:30, she was on the floor. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd slid down from the chair. She remembered the cold of the linoleum against her palms and thinking, distantly, that she should get up. She tried. Her arms didn't cooperate. The flickering light on the far left buzzed. The pain moved through her midsection in waves now, each one deeper than the last. Her phone was on the table above her. She reached up, got it on the second try, and lay back against the side of the filing cabinet with the screen in her lap. She opened her contacts. This was the part that she would think about for a long time afterward, not because of what happened next, but because of what she saw when she looked at the list. She scrolled and scrolled, and the names were mostly professional contacts, colleagues she'd exchanged information with, a few numbers she'd saved from her Atlanta life that she'd barely spoken to since she moved. There was no one she could call at midnight in Seoul who would come. There was no one here who was hers. Her thumb stopped on a number she had never called. She had saved it 7 months ago, during her first week, because she'd been told every member of the secretarial pool was required to have it. It was procedure. It was the kind of number you saved and never imagined using. Boss. Emergency only was what she'd labeled it. She stared at it for a long time. The pain hit her again, worse, and she pressed her forehead against the cold metal of the filing cabinet and waited for it to pass. And when it did, she picked up the phone again and pressed call before she could think about what she was doing. It rang 3 times. Kang. His voice was flat, businesslike, and in the background she could hear other voices and the particular acoustic quality of a large room. Amara's throat locked up. Boss. The word came out smaller than she intended. I'm sorry, I know it's late. I'm sorry for calling. I'm sorry. A brief pause. The background noise seemed to drop slightly, like he had moved somewhere quieter. Who is this? It's Amara. Amara Bennett. From the 9th floor secretarial office. I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have called. I know this is... Where are you? The question was very calm. It cut through her apology cleanly. The archive room, floor 9. I'm having a lot of pain, and I can call an ambulance. I couldn't... She stopped, swallowed. The next part was the part that cost her the most. Could someone possibly come? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Another pause, shorter this time. Don't move. The line went dead. What? The 42nd floor of Baeko Tower contained one of the most fortified private meeting rooms in Seoul. Its walls were soundproofed. Its windows faced away from any viable sightlines. The guest list that evening included representatives from 4 of the most powerful crime families operating in South Korea, and the agenda was a multi-billion-dollar distribution agreement that had been 18 months in the negotiation. Kang Jae-Hyun had been its architect. He was 32 years old, and he looked like what he was. A man who had been given the inheritance of violence at 21 and had built it into something that financial journalists wrote about in careful, oblique language, while everyone with actual knowledge understood perfectly well. He was not tall enough to be physically imposing, but he carried himself in a way that made the room reorganize itself around him. His suits were unremarkable. His watch was expensive, and he never mentioned it. He had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have survived situations where movement was lethal. When his phone buzzed during the meeting, he glanced at it, which was itself unusual. He never looked at his phone during meetings. When he stepped back from the table and said quietly, "I need to leave," the room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when something unexpected happens to someone who is never surprised. Hyun. It was Chairman Oh, 73 years old, and a man who had outlived 3 rivals and 2 of his own children. His voice had the particular quality of age weaponized. We are in the middle of... I know what we're in the middle of. Jae-Hyun was already moving toward the door. We'll reschedule. Han Seo-rin was on her feet. She had been seated near the end of the table, present in her capacity as his fiancée and de facto social liaison, a role she performed with precision and grace and the faintest possible edge of monitoring. She reached his arm before he reached the door. "Tell me it's business," she said, very low, her fingers on his jacket sleeve. "Tell me there's a crisis somewhere." "There is," he said. "What kind?" He looked at her. "Someone needs help." Her hand dropped. He left. He drove himself, which was unusual. His driver was on standby and would have been there in 4 minutes, but Jae-Hyun was already in the parking structure before that thought fully formed. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and he covered the 11 blocks between Baeko Tower and the secondary headquarters building, where the administrative offices were, where the archive rooms were, where a 28-year-old secretary was apparently alone on the floor, in less time than it should have taken. He didn't know Amara Bennett well. He knew her by sight. She was one of 43 members of the secretarial and administrative support staff across 3 floors. He had signed her employment paperwork in the way he signed all employment paperwork, efficiently, without ceremony. He had seen her in corridors and meeting rooms and had registered vaguely that she was the one who had walked into the glass door that one time. He'd heard about it from 3 different people in the same week, none of them unkindly, mostly because it was the kind of story that traveled. What he hadn't known was that she stayed this late, every night. That was a thing he was still processing when he pushed open the door to the archive room. She was on the floor with her back against the filing cabinet and her phone in her lap, and both arms wrapped around her midsection, and she looked up when the door opened with an expression that was one of the most complicated things he'd seen in recent memory. Relief, immediately crushed by humiliation, and underneath both of those, actual fear. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to pull you away from—" "Stop apologizing." He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her, and this close he could see how much color she'd lost, and how her breathing was off. "How long?" "An hour. Maybe more. It started earlier, but I thought it would—" "An hour." He said it flatly, not as a judgment, but the way you repeat something when you need a second to absorb it. Then he took out his phone and made a call that lasted approximately 40 seconds, during which he gave a location address and the words private, immediate, and quiet in that order. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and sat down on the floor next to her. She stared at him. He was the head of the Baeko Syndicate, and he was sitting on the linoleum floor of a 9th-floor archive room at midnight, and he didn't appear to find this remarkable. "Medics will be here in 8 minutes, he said. "Don't get up." "I wasn't going to," she admitted. "Good." A beat of silence. The flickering light buzzed. "The light does that every night," Amara said, because the silence was unbearable, and she needed to put something into it. "I know." She looked at him sideways. "You know." "I don't know specifically. I mean, I'm aware that kind of maintenance gets deferred." He wasn't looking at the light. He was looking at her, in the direct way he apparently looked at everything, and it was deeply uncomfortable to be examined by someone whose opinion of your professional competence you had been anxiously guessing for 7 months. "You've seen it before." It wasn't a question. "I stay late," she said, because clearly he had figured that out, and there was no point pretending. "Most nights. I know Manager Park said I shouldn't, but there's always more to do, and I didn't want to—" She stopped. "Didn't want to what?" She looked at her hands in her lap. "I didn't want to be the one who didn't try hard enough." The medics arrived in 7 minutes, not 8. They were discreet, as he'd specified. A private medical service that Baeko maintained for exactly these kinds of situations, the kind of emergencies that couldn't go through public records. They were efficient, and they didn't ask unnecessary questions, and they had Amara on a portable stretcher and an IV started within 10 minutes of arrival. The lead medic, a compact, gray-haired woman named Dr. Song, pulled Jae-Hyun aside while her colleague monitored vitals. "Gastric presentation," she said, without preamble. "Consistent with severe gastritis, possibly acute. I want her in a proper facility tonight. She needs imaging, and she needs fluids, and she needs sleep." She paused. "I'm going to guess she hasn't eaten a proper meal today." Jae-Hyun looked at Amara across the room. She was lying with her eyes half closed, one arm over her face, the IV line running into her other hand. She looked embarrassed even now, even prone on a stretcher in a building she had probably not told anyone she was still in. Arrange the transfer, he said. The private wing at Sungdo? Yes. He stayed until the transfer team arrived. Amara protested twice, once when she understood she was being moved to a private facility and not a general hospital, and once when she realized Jae-Hyun was still there. You really don't have to stay, she said. Her voice was steadier now that the IV was doing its work, but she still had both arms pressed against her midsection like she was holding herself together. I'll be fine. I'm sorry for calling. I know you had… The meeting will be rescheduled, he said. She blinked. They'll reschedule a meeting because of me? He didn't answer that directly. Is there someone I can call for you? Family? A friend in Seoul? The question was practical, clinical. He asked it the way he would ask for a file number. And Amara looked at him for a moment, and something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing that would be visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And then she looked away. No, she said quietly. There isn't really anyone. The archive room was silent except for the buzz of the broken light. Jae-Hyun stood very still. He had been in this building for 9 years. He had signed paychecks for hundreds of people, and he had been, in aggregate, aware of the general shape of their lives, their families, their emergencies, their career trajectories. He had assumed, not quite consciously, that the employees of Baeko existed within some kind of network, that they had people. He had assumed this because he had never asked. He had never had a reason to ask. All right, he said, and his voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. I'll follow the transport. She started to say something, probably another apology, and he held up one hand, not unkindly. Don't. She closed her mouth. Outside, Seoul moved through the night the way it always did, loud and lit and relentless, indifferent to what was happening in one small room on one small floor of one of its 10,000 buildings. Somewhere across the city, 11 of the most dangerous men in the country were sitting around a rescheduled meeting that was not going to go well. Seo-rin was somewhere in that building, furious and precise, and already planning what she would say in the morning. None of that, Jae-Hyun noted, felt particularly urgent. The transport team lifted Amara's stretcher and moved toward the service elevator. She kept her arm over her face. She didn't look back at the archive room and the flickering light and the filing tables where she'd been working for 7 months after everyone else went home. He followed. The private wing of Sungdo Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the particular silence of a place where wealthy people came to be sick without anyone knowing about it. Amara had never been in a room like this before. The bed had real sheets, not the stiff institutional kind. There was a window, and through it, the Seoul skyline burned against the dark in a way that looked almost manufactured, like a backdrop. She'd been in the city 7 months, and she still wasn't used to the scale of it, the way it kept going, in every direction, without apology. Dr. Song had given her something for the pain before the transport, and it was working now in the slow, cotton wool way. Pain medication works when your body is too exhausted to fight it. Her midsection still ached, deep and dull, but the sharp rolling waves had flattened out. She could breathe in a full breath without bracing for it. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the files she hadn't finished. That thought lasted about 3 seconds before a different thought replaced it. She had called her boss. At midnight. From the floor of an archive room. And he had come. And then he had sat down on the linoleum next to her. She pressed her free hand over her eyes and held it there. A knock at the door. Not the medical staff knock. That was 2 quick raps and then immediate entry. This was a single knock, deliberate, and then a pause. Come in, she said, though what she meant was please be a nurse. It was not a nurse. Kang Jae-Hyun stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with the kind of care people use when they don't want to disturb something fragile. He was still in the same suit he'd worn to whatever meeting she'd pulled him out of. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been awake for a very long time and who was not the type to let that show. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee. He set one on the side table near her bed. You don't have to drink it, he said. The nurse said no food yet, but you looked cold. She looked down at her own hands. She was cold. She hadn't noticed. Thank you, she said. The words felt completely inadequate, and she knew it. He took the chair near the window rather than the one closest to the bed, which she appreciated without being able to explain why. He held his own coffee in both hands and looked out the window for a moment, and she had the strange sense that he was giving her time to arrange herself, to find some version of composure before he spoke again. The diagnosis is acute gastritis, he said. Dr. Song will have the full results in the morning, but that's the working picture. I know what gastritis is, Amara said. Then, immediately, I'm sorry, that came out. You don't have to soften everything you say. She blinked. He looked at her directly. Every third sentence is an apology. You don't have to do that here. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved across the skyline. A plane, probably, its lights blinking slow and red. My manager told me to go home, she said, because it seemed important to say. 3 times. I want you to know that. He wasn't pushing me to stay. That was my choice. I know. How do you know? Park Hyun-soo has been with the company 11 years. He does not run a hostile floor. Jae-Hyun's voice was neutral. Not defensive of Park. Not dismissive of her. Simply stating a fact the way he seemed to state most things, with the precision of someone who had spent a long time separating what was true from what was convenient. Which means you stayed because you decided to. I want to understand why. Amara shifted against the pillows. The IV line tugged slightly, and she adjusted her arm. I already told you, she said. You told me you didn't want to be the one who didn't try hard enough. He turned the paper cup slowly between his palms. I want to know what that means specifically, what you were afraid would happen if you left on time. It was a strange thing to be asked a question that directly by someone with that kind of authority. She was used to being spoken at, or spoken around, or spoken about in the third person while she was standing right there. She was not used to being asked what she actually thought. I thought... She stopped, started again. Everyone I've seen succeed in that building works like that, all the time. And I know that's not... I know Manager Park says it's not required. But what people say and what the culture rewards are different things. And I'm... She looked at her hands. I'm new. I'm foreign. I don't have the relationships that the other assistants have. I can't afford to be the one who leaves early. You've been collapsing in stages for months, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than that. It was just accurate. And you kept going. Yes. Because you thought that's what survival looked like in that building. She met his eyes. Didn't it? The question sat there between them, honest and slightly hostile, and Jae-Hyun didn't answer it immediately. He drank his coffee. He looked back at the window. I don't know, he said finally, and the admission clearly cost him something, in the small way things cost people who are not accustomed to uncertainty. That's what I need to find out. He left around 2 in the morning after Dr. Song had come back through and confirmed the preliminary blood results, and told Amara she would need at least 3 days of rest, proper nutrition, and no work. Amara had nodded the way you nod at a doctor when you have no intention of following all the instructions. Dr. Song had looked at her in the specific way doctors look at people who think they're being subtle about not following instructions. Jae-Hyun had said nothing during this exchange, but in the corridor afterward, before he left, he stopped at the nurse's station and spoke to the charge nurse in Korean that was too low for Amara to hear from her room. She didn't know what he said. She found out the next morning when she tried to ask for her clothes and was told, with great professional gentleness, that they were being laundered and she was not to be discharged until Dr. Song cleared her, and that Mr. Kang had arranged for the room through the end of the week. Amara sat with that information for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the only number she had for him. He answered on the second ring. There was noise behind him, voices, a door closing, the sound of a day already in motion at what was probably very early. You don't need to pay for my room, she said, without preamble, because she'd had enough of softening things. The company's medical policy does not cover private wing accommodations, and I know that because I processed the benefits documentation during my first month. She heard him pause. Thank you, really. But I don't want you to feel like you owe me something because I had a bad night. Another pause, longer. That's not why I arranged it. Then why? Because you had no one else to call. And that's not a condition any employee of this organization should be in. The way he said it, not as a comfort, not as a platitude, but as an operational problem he had apparently already decided to address, made something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the gastritis. I'll be out of here by tomorrow, she said. You'll be out of there when Dr. Song clears you, he said. And he hung up. Han Seo-rin arrived at Byako Tower at 8:15 the next morning, 45 minutes before her usual time, which meant she had not slept well and had decided to do something about it before most of the building was awake enough to notice. She went to the 42nd floor first. Jae-Hyun's office was empty, which meant he'd either come and gone already or hadn't been back at all. She suspected the latter. His chair was at an angle that suggested he'd pushed back from the desk quickly, which meant he'd come in early, read through whatever had happened last night, and was already in motion somewhere in the building. She went to find his chief of staff, a precise, bespectacled man named Woo Jin-suk, who had the particular talent of knowing where Jae-Hyun was at any given moment without appearing to track him. "He's in the operations center," Jin-suk said before she asked. "For what?" Jin-suk's expression remained carefully neutral. He requested a full workforce audit, HR, operational staff, medical claims, after-hours activity logs, all divisions. Seo-rin stared at him. A workforce audit. Comprehensive. All levels. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has edges. "Because of last night," she said. Jin-suk did not confirm this. He didn't need to. She found Jae-Hyun in the operations center at the far end of the 38th floor, which was a room full of screens and analysts and the low, constant hum of a building that never fully went to sleep. He was standing at the main display table with a cluster of senior managers who all had the look of people who had been pulled into a room without adequate notice and were working hard not to show it. She waited by the door. Jae-Hyun clocked her presence immediately. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture, the fraction of a second where his attention moved and came back. But he finished the sentence he was in the middle of before he acknowledged her. "Run the after-hours logs across all 3 office buildings, not just the tower. I want to see duration patterns over the past 18 months, flagged by department, and I want medical leave data cross-referenced with the overtime logs." He looked at the analyst nearest him. "How long?" "End of day, sir. Maybe 6 tomorrow morning if we're thorough." "Be thorough." He turned and walked toward Seo-rin. She met him halfway, which was not a neutral choice. "You look terrible," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "I haven't slept." "I noticed." She held his gaze. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" "I'm running an audit." "Of the workforce?" "Yes." She exhaled, a controlled sound, barely anything. "Jae-Hyun, the Cheongwon meeting has to be rescheduled within the week, or Chairman Oh will take it as an insult. You know that. There are 3 other families waiting on that alliance. You walked out last night without a word." "I sent Jin-suk with an explanation." "Jin-suk told them there was a medical emergency." "There was." Her jaw moved. "A secretary. An employee of this organization who was alone on the floor of an archive room at midnight because she believed the only way to survive here was to work until she broke." He said it evenly, without heat, which was somehow more damning than anger would have been. "That's a problem that has nothing to do with her specifically and everything to do with how this place operates. And I need to know how widespread it is. And the Cheongwon Alliance waits while you—" "The Cheongwon Alliance waits, yes." The operations center was quiet except for the hum of the machines. Several analysts were very visibly not looking in their direction. Seo-rin stepped closer. When she spoke, her voice dropped to something that was almost intimate except for the temperature of it. "There are people in that meeting room who have been waiting 18 months for this deal. People who will see a rescheduled meeting as an opening. Families who have been patient because you asked them to be patient and who are now watching you prioritize what? Employee well-being over billions of dollars and the stability of 4 major syndicates." "Yes," Jae-Hyun said. "That's exactly what I'm prioritizing." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence. Seo-rin looked at him for a long moment. Her face did not change. That was one of the things he had always valued about her. She did not let things move across her face without permission. But he had known her long enough to read what wasn't visible. She was not angry. She was frightened in the cold, controlled way she permitted herself to be frightened. And that frightened him a little in return, because she was not a person who frightened easily. "You've changed," she said. Not an accusation, almost a diagnosis. "I've been informed of something," he said. I'm responding to it. That's not change, that's function." She stepped back. One precise step, the kind that means the conversation is over without the conversation being finished. I'll contact Jin Suk about the Cheongwon rescheduling, she said. Flat, professional. Back to what she was good at. You should sleep before you make any more decisions. She left. Her heels were very quiet on the operations center floor, which meant she was working hard at it. The audit results started coming in by 4 that afternoon. Jae-Hyun read them in his office with the door closed and Jin Suk across the desk from him, and the numbers were worse than he had expected, which was significant because he had not expected them to be good. 41% of non-managerial office staff logged more than 60 after-hours hours per month on average. Not occasionally, on average. The bodyguard division had a voluntary injury underreporting rate that Jin Suk, when pressed, admitted had been an open institutional understanding for at least 6 years. 7 executive assistants had not taken a full sick day in the past 12 months, despite the medical records showing clinic visits for stress-related conditions that should have mandated rest. One analyst had been coming in at 4:30 in the morning every weekday for 8 months, because he'd heard, secondhand, that the previous department head had rewarded early arrivals. The previous department head had left the company a year ago. The analyst was still coming in at 4:30. Jae-Hyun set down the report. Jin Suk waited. Who knew this was happening? Jae-Hyun said. It was not entirely a question. It was not a secret, sir. It was more like an assumption that this was how things operated, that it was self-selecting. The people who could sustain it stayed, and the ones who couldn't found other employment. Jin Suk's voice was careful, precise, the voice of a man relaying information he does not want to be the messenger of. It wasn't a policy anyone wrote down, but it was a policy. A pause. Yes, sir. In practice. Jae-Hyun stood up and walked to the window. 38 stories down, Seoul moved through the late afternoon with its usual total indifference. He stood there for a moment with both hands in his jacket pockets, and he thought about an archive room with a flickering light and a woman on the floor who had not called anyone for an hour because she was still trying to manage the situation on her own. He thought about her face when he'd asked if there was someone he could call. No, there isn't really anyone. I want to know how this started, he said, without turning around. I want to know at what point in this organization's history suffering in silence became a credential, because it didn't come from nothing. That's a longer inquiry, sir. That goes back to before your tenure. I know. He turned around. Start it anyway. Ciao. The captain's meeting was at 7 that evening, called on 40 minutes' notice, which was itself a signal that most of the men in the room read correctly. The Beko Syndicate's inner circle was 8 men between the ages of 38 and 61, and they had gathered in the private floor of the tower's secure conference suite with the collective energy of people who had been waiting for news and were not certain they were going to like it. Jae-Hyun laid out the audit findings. He was brief. He was specific. He did not editorialize. When he finished, the room was quiet for about 4 seconds, which was the kind of quiet that fills up fast. Captain Ryu, who was 57 and ran the distribution networks across 4 districts, was the first to speak. You're telling us you're going to restructure the work culture of the corporation because one secretary got sick. I'm telling you the audit revealed systemic patterns that represent significant operational risk. Employees who are chronically depleted make mistakes. Bodyguards who underreport injuries are security liabilities. Assistants who work until they collapse are not loyal. They're terrified. That's a failure of leadership, not a strength of culture. I know how we've always operated. Jae-Hyun's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. That's the problem. Captain Oh Young-jun, who was the youngest captain at 38 and had been with the syndicate since he was 23, leaned forward slightly. He was the one who was hardest to read, which meant he was usually the most dangerous to dismiss. The Chungwon families will hear about this, Young-jun said. They haven't already, but they will. And if they understand that you postponed a billion-dollar alliance because you drove to a hospital in the middle of the night for a junior employee, he let that sentence breathe. It will raise questions about judgment. People raise questions about judgment when they disagree with a decision, Jae-Hyun said. That's not a reason to avoid making it. It's a reason to consider timing. The timing was last night when I saw what we were doing to the people who work for us. Captain Ryu made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost not. You saw one person. I saw one person who had enough information to call me instead of an ambulance because she thought an ambulance would be a professional liability. Think about what that means." He looked around the table. "She was protecting the organization's reputation while she was lying on the floor in pain. That is not loyalty. That is fear. And I am not interested in running an empire on fear." The room was very still. Young-Jun sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then looked back at Jae-Hyun with an expression that was harder to parse than his usual neutrality. "The Governing Council," he said carefully. "If this goes forward, the restructuring, the policy changes, the resource reallocation, some of them will move to review your leadership. You know that." "I know. And you're prepared for that." "I'm prepared for that." Nobody said anything for a moment. Outside the windows, Seoul's nighttime grid blazed indifferent and eternal, the way it always had, the way it would long after every person in this room was gone. Captain Ryu put both hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was about to say something he knew would not land well. "You're risking everything," he said, "for a culture shift, for employee welfare policies, for the kind of thing corporations put in brochures that nobody actually follows." "If nobody follows them," Jae-Hyun said, "then we'll make sure they do." The meeting ended without consensus. That was, itself, a kind of answer. The call came at 11 that night. Jae-Hyun was still in the building. He'd sent his driver home and was working through the secondary audit files in his office when the phone rang. It was a number he recognized, which meant he almost didn't answer. Almost. Jae-Hyun. Chairman Oh's voice had the texture of gravel in a metal drum. 73 years old and still the most patient man in any room he entered, which meant he was also the most dangerous, because patience that old had weight behind it. "I've been receiving communications. I expected that. From 3 of the 4 Cheongwon families, and from 2 members of the Governing Council." A pause. "You understand what that means? They're organizing. They're positioning, which precedes organizing. There's a difference, but the window between them is narrow." Another pause. "What happened last night?" And Jae-Hyun told him. Briefly, without framing, without justification, just the facts in the order they'd occurred. The call, the archive room, the floor, the drive across Seoul, the audit results that had come in the following day. Chairman Oh was silent for a long time when he finished. "You've been running this organization for 11 years, the old man said finally. "In those 11 years, have you seen this before? Any part of it?" Jae-Hyun thought about it honestly. "I didn't look," he said. Another silence. Different quality. "The Governing Council will meet Friday," Chairman Oh said. "They've invoked emergency review protocols. You'll need to appear." Friday was 2 days away. 2 days to prepare a defense of decisions that Jae-Hyun did not intend to reverse. "I'll be there," he said. "I know you will." The old man's voice shifted, not softer, but different, lower, more interior, the way people speak when they're no longer managing an outcome and just saying what's true. "My eldest son worked for a company like this before he came into the family business. Not our kind of business, a regular company, shipping logistics. He never complained. He worked 16-hour days for 4 years. A breath. We lost him to a cardiac event at 31. The company sent flowers." Jae-Hyun said nothing. "I'm not saying anything about your decisions," Chairman Oh said. "I'm saying I'll be at the Friday meeting." The line went quiet. Amara didn't know about the audit. She didn't know about the captain's meeting, or the Governing Council review, or the calls Chairman Oh was receiving from 3 Cheongwon families. She didn't know that her name, or rather her position, since Jae-Hyun had been careful not to use her name, had been mentioned in rooms she would never be cleared to enter. She knew she was in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a view of Seoul that probably cost more per night than her monthly rent, and that somewhere in this city, a man she barely knew was apparently turning his entire organization upside down because she had called him from the floor. She found out some of it from Jin-Suk, who appeared at her door Thursday morning with a get-well card signed by her floor colleagues. She suspected he had organized this himself, quickly, because the signatures were all neat and the card was from a high-end stationer, and who mentioned with careful casualness that Mr. Kang had initiated a comprehensive review of company work culture protocols. "Because of me," Amara said. Not a question. Jin-suk adjusted his glasses. Because of what the situation revealed about organizational patterns. You were the occasion, not the cause. That's a very diplomatic way of saying yes. He almost smiled. Almost. Please focus on your recovery, Ms. Bennett. The organization will manage the rest. He left. She lay there and stared at the Get Well card, which had a cartoon bear on it holding a bowl of soup, and thought about all the people on her floor who had signed it, people who laughed when she walked into the glass door, people who probably thought of her as the clumsy one, the foreigner, the one who was going to wash out eventually. She thought about the audit, about what it might find. She thought about what it meant that Jae-Hyun had looked at her situation and seen a system, not a personal failure. She was not accustomed to that particular form of being seen. And then her phone buzzed with a notification that made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the gastritis. It was a message from an account she didn't recognize, routed through the company's internal system, which meant someone inside Baeko had sent it. It read, "You should know that people are talking. They're calling you the reason the Cheongwon deal almost fell apart. Some of them know who you are. When you come back to work, you're going to wish you hadn't." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the bed, pressed her hands over her face, and sat in the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that what she'd thought was the end of a crisis was actually the beginning of a much larger one. Amara read the message 4 more times, not because the meaning changed. It didn't. The meaning was perfectly clear on the first read. She read it again because her brain kept offering her alternate interpretations. Maybe it was misdirected. Maybe it was someone's idea of a dark joke. Maybe the internal system had malfunctioned somehow, and this was meant for someone else entirely. And each time she reached the end of it, the words were exactly what they'd been before. You should know that people are talking. They're calling you the reason the Cheongwon deal almost fell apart. Some of them know who you are. When you come back to work, you're going to wish you hadn't. She set the phone face down again, picked it up, set it down. The hospital room was very quiet. The Seoul skyline through the window was doing its usual indifferent thing, glittering and enormous and completely uninterested in what was happening inside this room. She thought about going to Jae-Hyun, forwarding the message, letting his security team trace the account, letting someone with actual power handle it. Then she thought about what that would mean. Another emergency. Another situation where she was the person at the center of the problem. Another reason for someone in that building to point at her and say, "See? See what she costs us." She took a screenshot of the message instead and sent it to her own email. Then she closed the app and put the phone on the side table and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, planning how to handle this herself. In the specific way people plan things when they're exhausted and in pain, and have decided, wrongly but completely, that asking for help a second time would be unforgivable. She did not sleep. By morning, she had made a decision. She was going to go back to work the moment Dr. Song cleared her. She was going to keep her head down. She was going to not be a problem. And whatever was happening in the rooms, she wasn't cleared to enter. The audits, the council meetings, the consequences of a phone call she should perhaps never have made. She was going to stay completely clear of all of it. It was, she would later understand, the worst decision she could have made. But it was a very human one. Well, Dr. Song cleared her Friday morning, with conditions she listed in the specific tone of someone who does not expect all of them to be followed and has made peace with that professionally. Rest. Regular meals. No skipped lunch breaks. A follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. Amara nodded at all of it with the same expression she'd used on Park Hyun-soo when he told her to leave on time. She was back at her desk by 1 in the afternoon. The floor noticed. She could feel it the way you feel weather. Not a specific thing, but a pressure change, a shift in the texture of the air. Conversations that went quiet a half-second too slowly. Eye contact held a fraction too long. One of the junior assistants, a 24-year-old named Choi Yuna, who sat 2 desks down and who had previously been reliably, chattily friendly, suddenly found her computer screen very absorbing when Amara walked past. Park Hyun-soo appeared at her office door within 10 minutes of her arrival, and the expression on his face was the particular combination of relief and apprehension that belongs to people who are glad you've returned and also aware the situation around your return is complicated. "You should have taken the full week," he said. "I'm fine. Dr. Song cleared me." Amara. He said her name the way people say a name when they mean something more than the name. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which he never did for routine conversations. There's been some talk while you were out. I want you to hear it from me rather than someone else. She kept her face neutral. She was getting better at that. What kind of talk? The Chungwon situation. People know the meeting was postponed because of a medical situation. Most people don't know it was you specifically, but he paused, pressed his lips together briefly. Some people do, or they've guessed. The 9th floor is not a large space, and you were the only one in the building that night. And people are angry. Some people are... He picked his words carefully. Park Hyun-soo was a careful man. It was what had kept him employed here for 11 years. Some people are processing what happened in ways that are not fair to you. I want you to know that if anything is said or done that crosses a line, you come to me immediately. She thought about the message on her phone, the account she'd screenshotted and filed away, and decided not to escalate. Of course, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the way people look at you when they think you're lying but can't prove it and don't want to force the issue. Okay, he said. He left. She opened her computer and started working. The governing council meeting was at 2 that afternoon in the tower's secure sub-level conference room, 3 floors below the main executive offices and entirely invisible to the building's standard security cameras. 12 men, most of them older than 60, representing the Baiko Syndicate's highest governing body, the body that had the authority to remove a sitting boss and had exercised that authority twice in the organization's 40-year history. Jae-Hyun arrived 4 minutes early and sat at his designated chair and waited while the rest filed in. He had slept 3 hours the previous night, which was more than the night before. He had reviewed the audit findings one more time that morning. He had spoken with Jin Suk and 2 of the legal team's senior advisors and had done all the preparation that preparation could do. Chairman Oh was the last to enter. He sat at the far end of the table and folded his hands and did not look at Jae-Hyun, which was not a hostile signal. It was a neutral one, which in this context meant he had not decided anything yet. Council Elder Park Seong-hwan, who was 68 and had served as the council's chief arbiter for 9 years, opened the session without ceremony. This council has been petitioned by 4 members to conduct a leadership review of the current boss of the Baiko Syndicate. The grounds cited are material breach of alliance obligations, unilateral restructuring of operational culture without council approval, and decisions that have demonstrably endangered the financial stability of the organization. He looked across the table at Jae-Hyun with the flat procedural gaze of someone performing a function. You've been informed of the grounds. Do you wish to respond before we proceed? Yes, Jae-Hyun said. He laid out the case. Not as a defense. He was careful about that, because the council would hear a defense as weakness, as justification, as the scrambling of a man who knew he'd overreached. He laid it out as a report. The call, the archive room, the audit, the numbers. 41% of non-managerial staff. The injury underreporting, the 4:30 in the morning analyst who was still doing it for a boss who'd been gone a year. The message he'd received from Chairman Oh about his eldest son. He did not mention Amara by name. When he finished, the room was quiet for the kind of duration that means something. Then Council Member Baek, 71, with the heavy hands and the permanent expression of someone who has heard too many things in too many rooms, leaned forward. The Cheongwon families have been in contact with this council, Baek said, directly, bypassing your office. Jae-Hyun had expected this. I know. They've communicated that the rescheduled meeting is acceptable. However, Baek's pause was surgical. They're adding a condition to the new terms. The employee protection restructuring you've announced, mandatory rest protocols, injury reporting requirements, the operational welfare review. They want those shelved, not modified, shelved, as a condition of signing. The room was very still. They see the reforms as a signal, Baek continued, that the Baiko leadership has become, in their word, sentimental. That an organization willing to restructure its entire operational culture over one employee's medical emergency is not the organization they made an 18-month investment in negotiating with. They're questioning whether Baiko's leadership can be trusted to prioritize the alliance over internal sentiment. Sentimental, Jae-Hyun repeated. His voice was level. Their word. And what's the council's position on the condition? Baek and Council Elder Park exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, and communicated volumes. The council has not yet taken a formal position, Park Seung-hwan said. That depends on the outcome of this review, but I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that several members believe the condition is reasonable, that the reforms can be revisited after the alliance is secured, that the financial and political stability of this organization must take precedence over, he paused, over what some members are describing as a moral impulse. Jae-hyun said nothing for a moment. He looked at the table, not at anyone in particular, at the surface, the wood, the reality of the room he was sitting in, and the decision that was sitting across from him. Then he looked up. The reforms stay, he said. I won't shelve them as a negotiating concession. If the Cheongwon families need me to prove my leadership by reversing a decision to protect the people who work for me, then their read of this organization's values is correct. And I'd like them to be wrong. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. It had weight and direction, like something falling. Chairman Oh looked at him for the first time since the meeting began. His expression was not readable, but he was looking. Council member Baek sat back in his chair. You understand you're gambling your position on this. I understand I'm deciding what kind of position I'm willing to hold, Jae-hyun said. The vote for formal review, which would determine whether he retained leadership, was called for that evening. It was Captain Oh Young-jun who came to find him afterward, while Jae-hyun was still in the sub-level corridor, coat in hand, waiting for the elevator. Young-jun fell into step beside him without announcement. He had a quality of silence that was different from other people's silence. It was inhabited, purposeful. 4 votes for review, Young-jun said. 3 against, 2 abstentions. I know, I was in the room. You needed 6 to block it. You got 3. The elevator arrived. They both got in. The vote this evening needs 7 to remove you. Right now you have 8 who won't vote removal. That's tight. I know. It only takes 1 to change their mind. Young-jun looked at the elevator doors. Between now and this evening, the Cheongwon families are going to make calls. They're going to remind certain council members what they stand to lose if this alliance falls apart. They have leverage with at least 2 of your 8. Jae-hyun looked at him. Are you warning me, or are you one of the 2? Young-jun's expression didn't shift. I'm warning you. What you do with it is your business. The elevator opened. Young-jun got out and didn't look back. Jae-hyun stood in the elevator for 1 more second, then followed. I was in his office when Jin-suk appeared in the doorway with the expression he wore when information had arrived, that he would prefer not to be the one delivering. The anonymous internal message, Jin-suk said. The one sent to the 9th floor archive room from the restricted medical suite. Jae-hyun went very still. What archive room? The one sent to Ms. Bennett's hospital room. Through the internal system. Jin-suk paused at whatever he saw in Jae-hyun's expression. You weren't aware. I wasn't aware. Each word was measured. Show me. Jin-suk set his tablet on the desk, and Jae-hyun read the message and read it again, and then set the tablet down with the particular deliberateness of someone who is deciding how angry to be, and choosing, for the moment, to postpone that decision until they have more information. When was this sent? Thursday night, 10:47 p.m., routed through an internal relay to disguise the origin account. But you traced it. Yes, sir. It took until this morning. Jin-suk's voice was carefully without inflection. The account belongs to the executive assistant pool, 12th floor, a woman named Bae Soo-jin. Jae-hyun did not recognize the name immediately, which meant she was not senior staff. Who does she report to? Jin-suk paused. The pause itself was informative. She is assigned to Captain Ryu's executive office, Jin-suk said, 12th floor coordinator. Captain Ryu, who had sat in the captain's meeting and called the reforms a waste and said, "You're risking everything," who had access to enough internal information to know Amara's hospital room was connected to the system, who had the means, the motive, and apparently the willingness to send a midnight threat to a woman recovering in a hospital bed. Get me Bae Soo-jin, Jae-hyun said, and don't tell Ryu, Chab. They brought Bae Soo-jin to the 38th floor conference room at 4:15. She was 31, with the polished, pressured look of someone who had worked hard to get where she was, and was now acutely aware of the possibility that it was about to be taken from her. She sat across from Jae-Hyun and Jin-Suk with both hands flat on the table and her posture very straight, which was either composure or its imitation. Jae-Hyun set a printed copy of the message in front of her. She looked at it. Her face didn't change, which was itself an answer. Surprise would have been immediate. "The account is registered under a relay," she said. Her voice was controlled. "You can't prove—" "We can," Jin-Suk said simply. "We did." A beat. Her jaw moved. "Did Captain Ryu ask you to send this?" Jae-Hyun said. His voice was the particular flat tone of someone who is not asking out of uncertainty. She looked at the message. "I made a decision on my own." "Did Captain Ryu ask you to send this?" Her hands pressed harder against the table. He said that the situation needed to be resolved quietly, that if the person involved understood what she'd cost the organization, she might make a different choice about coming back. He didn't. She stopped, swallowed. "He didn't tell me specifically to send a message. But he told you her name." A silence that was as clear as a confession. Jae-Hyun sat back. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone completing a calculation they already knew the answer to. "You're dismissed from Baeko, effective today," he said. "Jin-Suk will handle the paperwork. You will not make contact with any current employee. You will not discuss this with Captain Ryu or anyone else in this building." She nodded. Her composure had fractured in the way composure fractures when it's finally certain there's nothing left to protect. "And Ms. Bay," he said as she stood to leave. She stopped. "The person you threatened was in a hospital bed. She'd done nothing to you." She didn't answer. She left. Jin-Suk closed the door behind her. The room was very quiet. "Ryu," Jae-Hyun said. "Yes, sir." He accessed her identity. The Council's emergency review protocols should have restricted that information entirely. He looked at Jin-Suk, which means someone on the Council gave it to him. Jin-Suk adjusted his glasses. His face was very still. That would suggest that someone on the Council is coordinating with the captains who oppose the reforms before the vote this evening. "Yes," Jae-Hyun said, "it would." He went to see Captain Ryu himself. This was not the standard approach. Standard approach was security, formal procedure, a documented process. Jae-Hyun bypassed all of it and walked to the 12th floor at 4:50 and opened the office door without knocking, because knocking would have given Ryu 30 seconds to compose himself, and Jae-Hyun was not interested in giving him 30 seconds. Ryu was at his desk. He looked up, and the first thing across his face was not guilt. It was assessment, the fast, instinctive calculation of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and is already deciding which version of this he can survive. "You had someone send a threatening message to Amara Bennett," Jae-Hyun said. He closed the door. He did not sit down. "While she was in a hospital bed, with an IV in her arm." Ryu's expression settled into something that was not quite an admission and not quite a denial. It was the expression of a man choosing his ground. "I expressed concern to a staff member about the organizational consequences of the situation," Ryu said. "What she did with that conversation is on her. You gave her the name, the hospital information, the internal routing access. I manage a floor of 40 people. Information moves." Jae-Hyun looked at him. The particular stillness he was capable of, the one that had nothing performative in it, that was simply the outward form of a very complete focus, settled over the room like a change in air pressure. "You've been with this organization 19 years, Jae-Hyun said. "Yes. And in those 19 years you've watched 3 bosses make decisions you disagreed with." "Yes. And this is the first time you went around me." He said it without inflection. "Not to my face, not to the council, around me. To a junior employee in a hospital." Ryu's jaw was tight. "The reforms threaten everything this organization has built. The culture you're dismantling. The expectation of sacrifice, of total commitment. That's not a flaw, Jae-Hyun. It's what separates us from organizations that fall apart. You weaken that, and you weaken everything." "I didn't ask for your analysis," Jae-Hyun said. "I asked why you threatened a 28-year-old woman who was recovering from a medical emergency that your organization's culture caused." "She's not the point." "She's entirely the point." The silence crackled. "Your access to restricted council information before the formal vote process is a violation of charter, Jae-Hyun said. I'm suspending your captaincy pending review. Ryu's face went through something fast and ugly. The council vote is tonight. You don't have the authority without... Read the charter, Ryu. Emergency Protocol, Section 11. A boss has unilateral suspension authority in cases of verified charter violation. He moved toward the door. His hand was on the frame when Ryu spoke again. You won't survive the vote. Jae-Hyun stopped. Beck is going to flip, Ryu said. His voice was different now. Not the composed captain, something rawer under it, something that had been waiting. He's been talking to the Chungwon family reps all afternoon, and if Baek flips, you need 2 more from the neutral block, and you don't have them. You don't have 8 tonight. I know this because I've been doing the count with the people who actually understand what's at stake. Jae-Hyun turned around slowly. You've been working the council, he said, before the vote. I've been saving this organization. You've been trying to remove me. Ryu's chin lifted. Call it what you want. I'll call it what it is. Jae-Hyun's voice was very quiet now, the dangerous kind. You organized against me. You worked the council before the emergency review. You accessed restricted information and used it to threaten a civilian employee. And you've been doing the count. He paused. That's not saving the organization. That's a coup. The word hung in the air between them. Ryu said nothing. The vote was at 8 that evening. Jae-Hyun arrived to find the configuration of the room already shifted in the way rooms shift when informal negotiations have been happening before the formal proceedings begin. 3 council members who had been in their usual seats at the last meeting were now clustered at the far end of the table, proximate to council member Baek, in a way that wasn't accidental. Young Jun was in his chair, still, watchful, giving nothing away. Chairman Oh was at the far end, hands folded, and he looked at Jae-Hyun when he entered with an expression that was not encouragement and not abandonment and not quite either thing. He looked at him like a man who has made his own decision and is waiting to see if the calculation was right. Council Elder Park Sung-hwan called the session. The motion before this council is the formal removal of Kang Jae-Hyun from the position of boss of the Baeko Syndicate. The grounds. I need to add something to the record, Jae-Hyun said. Park looked at him. The session has been called. I know, I'm adding to the record. He looked around the table. Captain Ryu Sang-pil has been suspended pending review of a charter violation. Unauthorized access to restricted council materials prior to an active review session. This occurred today, before this meeting. I'm entering it as a procedural disclosure. The room moved, subtly, the way rooms move when information changes the geometry of a space. Beck's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a fraction. The specific nature of the violation, Council Elder Park said carefully, is relevant to this body. Captain Ryu accessed the identity and location of the employee at the center of this review, information that was restricted by emergency protocol, and used it to send a threatening communication through a proxy staff member. Jae-Hyun's voice was steady. To a 28-year-old woman in a hospital bed. The purpose appears to have been deterring her return to the organization and influencing the conditions around this vote. He looked at Baek directly. If this council votes to remove me tonight, that will be a legitimate exercise of this body's authority. But I want the record to reflect what some members of this body have been participating in. The silence in the room was complete. Beck's hands, visible on the table, were very still. Chairman Oh unfolded his hands and refolded them, slowly, and the gesture had the quality of something being decided. The vote was called. Jae-Hyun watched each council member's face in the moment before they announced their position, the way he had learned to watch faces in rooms like this, not for the obvious tells, but for the fraction of a second before the tell, the last private moment of a decision. When the count was done, Park Seung-hwan looked up from the tally. 7 to retain, 5 to remove. He had survived by 1 vote. 1 single vote. The room began to move, voices picking up, chairs pushing back, the particular exhale of a session that has concluded. Young Jun looked at Jae-Hyun from across the table with an expression that was the closest he ever came to anything resembling relief. Jae-Hyun felt none of the things he'd expected to feel. He felt the absence of something. The absence of the certainty he'd had walking into this room that the outcome was the right one regardless of the vote. Because 1 vote meant something. 1 vote meant that half this council had just watched the organization's leadership disclosed, and half of them had voted to remove him anyway. Half of them were still wrong about what Baeko was. And that meant the real fight was not the one that had just ended. He was still sitting in his chair when most of the room had emptied. Jin-suk was at the door. Chairman Oh was moving slowly toward the exit, and he paused beside Jae-hyun's chair. "One vote," the old man said. "Yes. The Chungwon families will hear the outcome within the hour. They'll issue their condition again. Formally this time. The reforms removed from the terms, or they withdraw the alliance entirely." Jae-hyun said nothing. "And you'll refuse again," Chairman Oh said. "Yes." The old man looked at him with the particular expression of someone very old watching someone much younger arrive at the precise place they always knew they were going and not knowing whether to be glad or sorry for it. "Then the alliance is gone," the old man said. "And you'll have survived the council by one vote and lost hundreds of millions and the support of 3 captains and your engagement, all for reforms that half your own governing body doesn't believe in." He paused. "How do you live with that?" Jae-hyun looked at the empty table, at the chairs that had just held 11 men deciding his fate. "Ask me in a year," he said. But before Chairman Oh reached the door, Jae-hyun's phone lit up on the table with a message from Jin-suk, sent 30 seconds ago, flagged urgent. He read it. Then he read it again. It said, "Ms. Bennett has gone to the council chamber. She told the security desk she has something to say, and she won't leave until someone listens. The council chamber. Amara Bennett, who had been cleared from the hospital this morning, who had gone back to her desk on the 9th floor and kept her head down, who had received a threatening anonymous message and told no one and said nothing, was standing in the security lobby of the council's restricted floor, alone, demanding to be heard." Jae-hyun was on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision to stand. The security lobby on the council's restricted floor was not a place that received unannounced visitors. It had 2 guards, a desk, a biometric entry panel, and a camera array that fed directly to Jin-suk's monitoring station 3 floors up. The walls were the particular shade of gray that expensive buildings use when they want to communicate authority without ostentation. There was no seating. The absence of seating was intentional. This was not a place where you waited comfortably. This was a place where you stated your purpose and were either cleared or removed. Amara was standing in the middle of it when Jae-hyun arrived. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when she came back to the office that afternoon. Dark slacks, a cream blouse, her work badge still clipped to her collar. She looked like someone who had made a decision quickly and left before she could talk herself out of it, which was exactly what had happened. One of the guards was standing closer to her than standard protocol required, not touching her, but positioned in the way guards position themselves when they're uncertain whether a situation is going to require physical management. She was not making it easy for him to decide. She was standing very straight, both arms at her sides, and she was talking to the guard in Korean that was careful and deliberate. Not fluent, but functional, and she was apparently telling him something that he didn't know what to do with, because his expression was the specific blankness of a man waiting for a supervisor. Jae-hyun came through the access door, and the guard's attention snapped to him immediately with visible relief. Amara turned. She saw him, and something moved through her face. Not the apology he'd grown accustomed to seeing, not the flinch. Something harder than that. Something that had made a decision and was committed to it even though she was terrified. He could see the terrified part in the way she was breathing. Short, controlled, the way you breathe when your body is producing adrenaline and you're telling it to stand down. "Ms. Bennett," he said. He kept his voice level. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to the council," she said. The guard looked at Jae-hyun. Jae-hyun held up one hand, the small gesture that meant, "I have this," and the guard stepped back. "The session has concluded," Jae-hyun said. "I know, Jin-suk told me." She'd called Jin-suk. He filed that detail away. "I know it's over, but I heard you survived by one vote, and I heard the Cheongwon families are going to issue the condition again. The one about the reforms." She held his gaze. "I need to talk to whoever's still in the building." "Amara." He said her name, not her title, for the first time, and something in her posture shifted fractionally at the sound of it. "The council session, please." The word was not a performance. It was not strategic. It was the word a person uses when they have already used every other option in their inventory. And this is what's left. "I know I don't have the clearance to be on this floor. I know I'm probably going to get walked out of here in the next 4 minutes. But I have something to say, and I need someone in that room to hear it before they make the decision about the Cheongwon condition. She took a breath. I found out about the condition, that they want the reforms shelved. And I found out tonight what it's going to cost you if you refuse. All of it. She paused. Jin-suk told me what you refused to do. Jae-Hyun looked at her for a moment, then he turned to the guard. Go back to your post. The guard went. The lobby was suddenly very quiet. Who else is still upstairs? Jae-Hyun said. Chairman Oh hasn't left. Young-jun is waiting in the hallway. Baek. She paused. Council Elder Park. He pulled out his phone and sent a single message to Jin-suk. 2 words. Arrange it. Then he looked at Amara and said, You understand this is irregular. I understand it's probably the most irregular thing that's happened in this building in a decade. Her voice was very dry, very flat, and it surprised him enough that he almost smiled. I'm okay with that. You're going to talk to a room of men who have spent the past 48 hours deciding your existence in this organization is a problem. I know. And you came anyway. She held his gaze. Someone taught me that asking for help isn't a weakness. I'm still working on believing that, but I figured coming here was at least practice. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Come with me. The council chamber on the sub-level floor was a room designed to be intimidating, and it succeeded. The table was long and dark, and the chairs were high-backed, and the lighting came from sources that were not immediately visible, which gave the room the quality of a space that had its own weather. It smelled faintly of old wood and the kind of coffee that's been sitting in a carafe for hours. 7 of the 12 council members were still present when Jae-Hyun brought Amara through the door. The effect of her entrance was immediate and specific. Not surprise exactly. Several of them had been told by Jin-suk that there was a situation in the lobby, but something more uncomfortable than surprise. The discomfort of being confronted with the physical reality of a person you've been discussing in the abstract. She was 28 years old, and she was a plus-size black woman in office clothes, and she stood in the doorway of the most restricted room in the Baiko organization, and she looked at the men around that table the way someone looks when they have decided they are not going to be small in this room, regardless of how much they want to be. Chairman Oh, at the far end, looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something else, something that was slower and more interior. Council Elder Park Sung-hwan did not look pleased. This is a restricted... I know, Amara said. Her Korean landed on the room first, before she switched to English, and the switch was deliberate. She was not going to have her meaning filtered. I'm sorry for the interruption. I know I don't belong in this room. I know this is irregular, and I know there are probably 12 security protocols I've just violated, and I will deal with all of those. She moved to the near end of the table and put both hands on the surface, not sitting, just anchoring herself. But I need 5 minutes. Park Sung-hwan looked at Jae-Hyun. Let her speak, Jae-Hyun said. A pause. Then the council elder sat back. 5 minutes. Amara took a breath. Not a steadying breath, so she was past the point where steadying was possible, and she seemed to know it. Just air, functional, keeping her going. My name is Amara Bennett. I'm the secretary from the 9th floor who caused all of this. She said it flat and without apology. I've heard different things about what's been said in this room over the past 2 days. I know that some people here think I'm the reason a billion-dollar deal almost fell apart. And I know that some people in this building think that if I had stayed quiet, if I had not made a phone call, none of this would be happening. She looked around the table. They're right. If I had stayed quiet, you wouldn't be here right now. Neither would he. She didn't look at Jae-Hyun. But I want to be clear about something. Nobody ordered me to stay in that building past midnight. Nobody told me to skip meals. Nobody sat me down on my first day and said, Amara, we expect you to work until you collapse. She paused. Let that sit. They didn't have to. Because the message was everywhere. In who got promoted and who got passed over. In the pride people took in not taking sick days. In the way people talked about employees who left on time. Not with anger, just with that particular quiet that means they don't expect much from you anymore. She pressed her hands harder against the table. I didn't stay because anyone made me. I stayed because I was afraid. Because I'm new here and I'm foreign, and I'm the one who's always making the small mistakes. And I believed completely that the only way to earn my place was to make myself indispensable through sheer exhaustion. Baek, who had not said anything since Jae-Hyun had disclosed Ryu's charter violation, was watching her with an expression that had lost its political coding. He just looked like a man listening. I heard about the condition, Amara said. The Chungwon families want the reforms shelved, and I know what it means if he refuses. I've heard the numbers, the financial cost. She looked at Park Sung-hwan. And I need someone in this room to understand something before you make any more decisions. She paused. He didn't do this for me. The room was very still. He did this because of what I told him without meaning to, that I didn't leave because I thought leaving would cost me my job. And then he found out I wasn't the only one. He found out 40% of your staff thinks the same thing. He found out your bodyguards don't report injuries. He found out you have an analyst coming in at 4:30 in the morning for a boss who's been gone a year. Her voice was very level. He did this because your organization, not his reforms, your organization as it was, had created a system where people hurt themselves every day, quietly, because they thought the organization demanded it. He saw that, and he decided it was more important to fix it than to preserve the deal. She stopped. You don't have to agree with that decision. Some of you clearly don't. But don't make the mistake of thinking it was sentimental. He is not a sentimental man. She finally looked at Jae-Hyun briefly, then back at the room. It was a strategic decision about what kind of organization you want to be in 10 years. Whether your strength comes from people who are terrified or people who are committed. Chairman Oh's hands unfolded from the table's surface. He looked at Amara with the attention of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing it. The reforms, he said. His voice was rough, low. You think they'll hold? I think they won't hold automatically, she said. I think culture is stubborn and change is slow, and there will be people in your organization who resent them for years. But I think the fact that they exist, that someone in that chair decided they mattered more than a financial concession, means something. She paused. I think it means your people know, maybe for the first time, that the person leading them is paying attention, and that is worth more than people will admit in a room like this. Young Jun, who had been in his chair with his arms crossed and his face unreadable for the entire duration, made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Not agreement. Something between the two that meant he had just heard something he hadn't expected to hear from someone he hadn't expected to say it. Amara straightened up. She took her hands off the table. That's all I have, she said. I know I don't have standing in this room. I know everything I've said tonight can be dismissed because I'm the person at the center of this, and I obviously have a stake in the outcome. She looked around one more time without flinching. But you're about to make a decision that affects every person who works in this building. And I thought someone should say it plainly. Those people are watching. They know what's happening in these rooms, even when you think they don't. And the decision you make tonight tells them everything about who they're working for. She turned and walked toward the door. She made it 4 steps before Councilmember Beck said, Ms. Bennett. She stopped. She turned. Beck looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been doing a calculation for a long time and has just arrived at an answer he wasn't expecting. I voted to remove him tonight, Beck said. Not as a confession, as a statement of record. I want you to know that. I voted to remove him because I believe the alliance is critical and the financial risk is real, and I was not wrong about those things. Amara said nothing. I'm going to call an emergency session tomorrow morning, he said, to formally ratify the reforms as organizational policy. He looked at Jae-Hyun. It won't be unanimous, but it will be a majority. He looked back at Amara. You should be aware that a ratification will not compel the Chungwon families to renegotiate. The financial loss is real regardless. I know, Amara said. You came here anyway. Yes, sir. He nodded once, slowly, and turned back to the table. Amara left. The corridor outside the chamber was empty except for Jin-Suk, who was standing near the elevator with the look of a man who has just watched something happen that he does not have a category for, and is quietly constructing one. Amara stood in the corridor with her back against the wall, and her hands pressed flat against the surface behind her, and she breathed. In, out. The adrenaline was crashing now, the chemical debt coming due, and her legs were not entirely steady, and her midsection had the particular deep ache that Dr. Song had told her would come back if she didn't rest. She was very much not resting. Jin-Suk brought her a cup of water from somewhere without being asked and set it near her and stepped back. She drank it. The elevator opened and Jae-Hyun came out and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him and waited. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read, which was probably the default for a man who had built an entire career on being unreadable. That was either very brave or very reckless, he said. Both, she said. Definitely both. A pause. Beck is calling the emergency session, he said. I heard. It won't stop the financial consequences. The Changwon families will formalize their withdrawal regardless of what the council ratifies internally. I know. Hundreds of millions of dollars. I know. She held his gaze. Are you angry? He looked slightly startled, which was the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen on him. At what? At me. For being in this building. For making it worse. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I'm not angry. You should probably be at least a little angry. Probably. He looked at the corridor, at nothing in particular, and his exhale was long and controlled and had the quality of a man releasing something he'd been holding for 2 straight days. Go home, Amara. You were discharged from the hospital this morning, and you've done more today than... I'll leave in a minute. She pushed off the wall. She was steadier now that the adrenaline had finished draining. I need to tell you something first. He waited. The message. The anonymous one. I got it Thursday night, and I didn't tell you. She said it directly, without apology, because she'd promised herself she was going to stop doing that. I should have. I chose not to because I didn't want to be a problem again. And I understand that's probably frustrating to hear. Jin-suk found it, he said. I know. He told me. She held his gaze. I'm sorry I didn't bring it to you myself. I was trying to handle it. I know. I won't do that again. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, just the way light changes in a room when something moves in front of a window. Ryu has been suspended, he said. The staff member who sent the message has been dismissed. There won't be more of it. Thank you. Don't thank me. That was basic function. He looked at her. Go home. She went. The next 12 hours were the hardest operational hours Jae-Hyun had navigated in 3 years. The Chungwon family representatives issued the formal withdrawal at 9 the next morning via legal communication to Jin-suk's office. 2 sentences, precise, cold, final. The alliance was withdrawn pending reconstitution of terms. The terms they proposed as reconstitution were the same terms they'd proposed before. The reform package shelved, the new welfare protocols removed, a signed commitment that internal cultural changes would not affect the operational parameters of the syndicate's external agreements. Jae-Hyun read the communication at his desk and then set it face down. Jin-suk was at the door. Do you want me to draft a response? Not yet. The financial team is asking for a meeting. The loss projection. I've seen the loss projection. They've revised it upward. The withdrawal affects secondary contracts that were contingent on the Cheongwon alliance. It's not just the primary deal. There's a cascade. Jin-suk paused. The new number is significant, sir. How significant? Jin-suk told him. Jae-Hyun sat with that number for a moment. It was the kind of number that changed the shape of a room just by being spoken. Schedule the financial meeting for this afternoon, he said, and tell them to bring the secondary contract analysis. I want to understand the full cascade before we make any decisions. Yes, sir. Jin-suk hesitated. And Ms. Han? Seorin. He hadn't spoken to her since the operations center encounter 2 days ago. She had called once, yesterday evening, and he'd let it go to voicemail and then read the transcript Jin-suk had prepared because listening to her voice in that moment had not been something he trusted himself to do well. I'll call her, he said, after the financial meeting. Jin-suk left. He sat in his office and looked at the face-down communication from the Cheongwon representatives and thought about the cascade, about what it meant in real terms, the employees who would be affected, the operational changes that would have to be made, the months of rebuilding trust with partners who had been watching this situation and were now making their own calculations. He thought about the council vote that had kept him in this chair by one single margin. He thought about Amara standing at the council table with her hands pressed against the wood, telling 12 of the most dangerous men in the organization that their people were watching. He turned the communication back over. Read it again. Then he pulled up the reform package documentation. 43 pages of new policy, drafted by his operations team over the past 48 hours, covering mandatory rest protocols, injury reporting systems, a new metrics framework for management evaluation, and a whistleblower structure that had teeth. He read through it from the beginning. He was on page 19 when his door opened without a knock. Seo Rin. She was in a charcoal coat and her hair was precisely arranged, and her face was the face she wore in public and professional settings, which meant she had made a decision about how to conduct this conversation before she arrived. He set the document down. "I wasn't going to call first," she said. She closed the door, sat down across from him without being invited, which she had always done and which he had always found, depending on the day, either compelling or exhausting. "I needed to see you in person. Okay? The Changwon withdrawal was announced this morning." "Yes." "And you're not going to counter?" "Not on their terms." She exhaled. It was the controlled kind. "Jae-Hyun, I need you to help me understand something." She leaned forward slightly. "Not the business decision, not the council vote. I understand those things. I disagree with some of them, but I understand the reasoning." She paused. "I need you to help me understand what happened to you in that archive room." He looked at her. "Nothing happened to me." "Something changed." Her voice was very even. It cost her. "You walked into that building the same man you've been for 11 years and you came out different. And I don't—" She stopped. Composed herself in the small way she composed herself. The particular micro-adjustment of someone keeping something in. "I need to understand if this is something I can adapt to or something that means we're—" She didn't finish that sentence. He took his time answering. He owed her that. "I walked into the archive room," he said, "and there was a person on the floor who had no one to call. And the reason she had no one to call was partly circumstantial and partly because this organization had spent years training its people to treat isolation as competence." He looked at his hands. "I came out knowing something I should have known before. That's not change. That's information." "It changed your decisions." "Yes." "It changed you." She said it carefully. The man I've been with for 4 years would not have walked out of a Chungwon meeting for a junior secretary." "No," he agreed. "He wouldn't have." The honesty of that sat between them. "And you don't regret it," she said. "I regret the cascade effect. I regret the financial loss. I regret that people I respect disagree with the decision." He met her eyes. "I don't regret the decision." Seo-Rin sat very still for a moment. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was doing the calculation that she'd been building toward for a long time and had finally arrived at the last variable. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. Her voice was quieter now. The professional layer had thinned. "That night, you left a room full of the most important strategic partners this organization has. You drove across the city. For her." She paused. "And I keep asking myself, in 4 years, have you ever—" She stopped again. "Seo-Rin, have you ever driven across the city for me?" The question was very quiet. And it was not about the drive. They both understood that. He looked at her for a long moment. And he didn't answer because the answer was complicated, and because the silence itself was already telling her what the words would have said more slowly. She nodded once, a small, precise movement. "All right," she said. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the frame, and she turned back once. "The reforms are the right thing," she said. "I want you to know I believe that. I just don't know if they were worth what they cost." She paused. "I hope you figure out if they were." She left. The office was very quiet. He sat with the quiet for approximately 45 seconds, which was all the time he permitted himself. And then he picked up the reform package documentation and went back to page 19. The financial meeting at 3 that afternoon was brutal, in the specific way financial meetings are, when the numbers are real and the people delivering them are trying to be professional about something that genuinely hurts. The revised projection covered the primary Cheongwon withdrawal, the cascade effect on 4 secondary contracts, the adjustment costs of implementing the new reform protocols across both the syndicate and the corporation, and the projected operational impact over the following 18 months. The total was the kind of number that, spoken aloud in a room, produced a silence that lasted longer than most silences. Jae-Hyun looked at it and did not look away from it. "The reform implementation costs," he said. That number is fixed regardless of the Cheongwon outcome. Yes, sir. Then the variable is the contract cascade. Which of the four secondary contracts has the highest reconstitution probability? Meaning, which partners are most likely to renegotiate once the Cheongwon situation is either resolved or replaced? The financial team lead, a thin, precise woman named Cha Mira, who had been with the organization 8 years, looked up from her presentation with the expression of someone who had not expected that particular question. She'd prepared for arguments about reversing the reforms. She'd prepared for discussions about damage limitation and optics management. She had not apparently prepared for strategic rebuilding questions. The Hansin Group, she said after a moment, and possibly the Daewoo shipping contract. Both of those have relationship foundations that predate the Cheongwon negotiation. Set up conversations, not formal, informal, exploratory. He looked around the table. We're not going to operate in contraction mode. We're going to rebuild from a different foundation. He paused. The reforms stay. The financial strategy adapts around them, not the other way around. Chamira looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something down. He was walking back to his office from the meeting when his phone rang. It was Young Jun. He answered. The council ratification session is tomorrow morning, Young Jun said, without preamble. 8 votes confirmed. It'll pass. Baek? He's one of the 8. A pause. He's also been on the phone with the Cheongwon representatives this morning on his own initiative, without council authorization. Jae-Hyun stopped walking. To what end? That's what I'd like to know. Young Jun's voice was careful. He voted against you last night and then apparently changed his approach significantly after your secretary addressed the room. Now he's making independent calls to the families you just lost the alliance with. A pause. I can't tell you if that's him trying to repair something or him positioning for whatever comes next. Can you find out? I'm working on it. A breath. You should know there are 2 captains talking to Ryu despite the suspension. Not formal meetings, just conversations. His pause had an edge. You're not stable yet. 1 vote is not stable. I know. The woman, Young Jun said. His voice shifted fractionally. The secretary. What she did last night. That was either the most extraordinary piece of advocacy I've seen in a council room or a very sophisticated political maneuver. I genuinely don't know which. It wasn't a maneuver, Jae-Hyun said. I know. A pause. That's what made it work. The call ended. Jae-Hyun stood in this corridor for a moment with his phone in his hand and Seoul doing its thing outside the glass, vast and lit and relentlessly in motion. And he thought about the cascade and the vote margin and Ryu's suspended captaincy and Seo Rin's final question and Bayek's phone calls and Young Jun's warning and the 43 pages of reform documentation he still needed to finish reading. He thought about an archive room with a flickering light. He thought about a woman who had come to a council chamber alone, with no clearance and no standing and no protection except the plainness of what she had to say. He pulled up her contact and typed a message. Brief, operational. The way he wrote most messages. The council session is tomorrow at 0900. The reforms will be formally ratified. I want you to be aware of that before you hear it from anyone else. He sent it. 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Her response was 2 words. Thank you. And then, a few seconds after that, a second message. How are you doing? He stared at that for a moment. Nobody had asked him that. Not once in the past 72 hours. Not Jin Suk, not Young Jun, not Seo Rin, in her controlled and devastating exit from his office. They'd asked him about the vote and the numbers and the strategy and the position. Not one of them had asked the other thing. He typed, I don't know yet. Her response came back almost immediately. That's an honest answer. And then, get some sleep. He almost smiled. Almost. I was back in his office at 6 that evening, working through the secondary contract analysis with Cha Mira's team via conference call, when Jin Suk appeared at the door with the expression he wore for information that changed the shape of a room. Jae-Hyun put the call on hold. Baek, Jin Suk said. His calls to the Cheongwon representatives this morning. We have the content. How? Young Jun. Jin Suk adjusted his glasses. Baek contacted the primary Cheongwon family representative and proposed a modification. Not the withdrawal of the reforms, something different. He paused. He proposed that the Chungwon alliance proceed at a reduced value, substantially reduced, but with all reform protocols intact. Jae-Hyun said nothing. The family representative has not responded formally, Jin-suk continued, but they haven't rejected it. The channel is still open. He set a document on the desk. Beck did this without council authorization, without your authorization. He made a unilateral approach to a negotiating party on behalf of the organization. Yes, Jae-Hyun said. He did. Which is a charter violation, similar to what Ryu. I know what it is, yeah. He looked at the document. It's also possibly the thing that saves this organization several $100 million. The room was very quiet. You're not going to move on the violation, Jin-suk said. He said it without judgment, just the precision of a man making sure he understood the situation correctly. Beck voted against me in that room. He coordinated with Ryu before the vote. He has been a political obstacle for the past 48 hours. Jae-Hyun looked at the document. And then a 28-year-old secretary stood in front of him without any standing or leverage and told him plainly what was at stake for the people in this building. And he changed course. He paused. If that's the result of what Amara said in that room, I'm not going to punish it on a technicality. Jin-suk said nothing for a moment. Then, what do you want me to do? Tell Young-Jun to let the channel stay open. Don't contact Beck directly. Don't acknowledge what he's doing. Not yet. He looked at the secondary contract document. Let him finish what he started. Jin-suk nodded. He turned to leave. Jin-suk? He stopped. When this is over, Jae-Hyun said, the reform documentation, the whistleblower protocols, the injury reporting systems, the management evaluation metrics, I want you to take personal responsibility for the implementation oversight. Jin-suk turned back. His expression was the closest it ever came to being openly moved, a very subtle alteration in the arrangement of his features. Yes, sir. And I want anonymous feedback mechanisms built into every level of the structure, real ones, with actual consequence. He looked at the window. No one should ever have to call their boss from the floor of an archive room because they don't know who else to turn to. Understood. The city moved outside the glass. Seoul at 6 in the evening was a particular kind of motion. The day shift bleeding into the night shift, the overlap of 10 million lives adjusting their rhythms. Somewhere in that motion, on the 9th floor of a secondary building 11 blocks away, a secretary with acute gastritis and a work badge and a history of walking into glass doors was either at her desk or, if she had listened to Dr. Song and also to him, at home. He hoped she was at home. He suspected she was at her desk. He picked up his phone. The message he sent was 3 words. Go home, Amara. He waited. 1 minute, 2. Her response arrived in the form of a photograph. It was a slightly blurry, clearly taken from the hip image of her apartment window with the Seoul skyline outside it, taken from the angle of someone sitting on their couch. In the foreground, barely in frame, was a bowl of something steaming. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. He set the phone down. He did not smile. But something in the room was different after that. In the small way rooms are different when the weight in them shifts. He picked up the secondary contract analysis. He worked. Outside, Seoul burned its lights against the dark. And somewhere in the Baiko organization's 43 pages of new policy, 41% of non-managerial staff were going home for the first time in a long time, without the specific terror of wondering if leaving on time would cost them everything. Not because the culture had already changed, because cultures don't change overnight, but because for the first time, someone in the chair that mattered had decided their exhaustion was not a credential. And in the sub-level council chamber, empty now, the chair where Amara Bennett had placed her hands on the table and looked at 12 dangerous men without flinching, still held, in the faint impression of warmth, the evidence of something that had no name in this organization's charter and no line in its financial projections and no precedent in its 40-year history. Something that had walked in through the lobby and office clothes with no clearance and no leverage and said what needed to be said. And the building, without knowing it, had shifted 1 degree. 1 degree was enough. It had to be. Because tomorrow morning, the formal vote would come. And everything that had been broken open over the past 4 days, every cracked alliance, every suspended captain, every revised financial projection, every conversation that had happened in rooms that Amara was not cleared to enter, was about to be forced, by the specific machinery of this organization to come to a point. And Jae-Hyun sat in his office with 43 pages of reform policy and a photo of someone's couch and a Seoul skyline, and the knowledge that he had survived by one vote and lost a fiancé and a billion-dollar alliance, and the certainty of knowing exactly what kind of man he was. He had all of those things. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, completely certain he was sitting in the right chair. The formal ratification session began at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, 6 days after a woman had called her boss from the floor of an archive room and set everything in motion. The council chamber filled slowly, not the way it had filled for the emergency review. That had been fast, purposeful, the gathering of men who had been summoned and knew why. This was different. Council members arrived in ones and twos, speaking in low voices, carrying coffee and paper cups from the executive floor kitchen, which was itself unusual. The paper cups were a small signal. This was a session they were treating as workmanlike rather than ceremonial. Something to be done, not performed. Jae-Hyun arrived exactly on time, which was his habit, and which had always carried the particular message that he was not early enough to appear anxious or late enough to appear dismissive. He sat in his chair and he looked at the room and he counted, from long practice, who was where and what that meant. Baek was already seated. He did not look at Jae-Hyun when he came in, which was not hostility. It was the studied neutrality of a man who had changed direction in the night and was not yet ready to discuss the change openly. Young-Jun was in his usual chair. He looked at Jae-Hyun once, briefly, when he entered, and gave the smallest possible nod, which in Young-Jun's language meant the count held. Chairman Oh arrived last, as he usually did, and he sat at the end of the table and he folded his hands and the session began. Council Elder Park read the formal motion. Ratification of the Baeko Syndicate's Organizational Welfare Reform Package, 43 pages, covering mandatory rest and medical reporting protocols, management evaluation frameworks including employee protection metrics, anonymous feedback and whistleblower systems, and a biannual independent compliance review. He read it without inflection. The motion was the motion. The council had seen the document. There was no preamble needed. The vote was called. 8 for ratification, 4 against. The reforms were formally adopted as organizational policy. The room exhaled in the collective, barely audible way rooms exhale when something significant has concluded. Park Seong-hwan recorded the result in the session log with the specific efficiency of a man who has been doing this a long time and finds precision a reliable comfort. Then Baek spoke. "There's a secondary item," he said, "not on the formal agenda, but relevant to the council's record." Park looked at him. "The session agenda is closed." "I'm aware," Baek's voice was steady. "I was 61 years old and had been in this organization since he was 32, and he carried that history in the way men carry long histories, visibly, in the set of his jaw and the particular economy of his movements. I'm asking the council's indulgence for 3 minutes." Park looked at the room. No one objected. He nodded. Baek put both hands flat on the table. "I voted against the boss in the emergency review 2 nights ago. I want the record to reflect that I stand by the reasoning behind that vote. The financial risk was real and remains real, and I was not wrong about the numbers." He paused. "I was wrong about the weight I assigned to them." Nobody said anything. "I've been in contact with the Cheongwon family representatives," he continued, "on my own initiative, without council or executive authorization. I'm disclosing this now because the charter requires it, and because I'm not interested in a repetition of what happened with Ryu's violation." He looked at Jae-Hyun directly, for the first time that morning. "I proposed a modified alliance structure, reduced value, all reform protocols intact. The primary representative has indicated a willingness to consider the proposal. I don't know if it will hold, but the channel is open." The room was very still. "I did this," Baek said, "because a 28-year-old woman with no standing in this room told me something I needed to hear. And I was old enough and had been in enough rooms like this one to recognize it when I heard it." He looked at his hands. The record can reflect that as well. Chairman Oh was watching Baek with the expression of someone observing something that they had not predicted and are adjusting to with genuine surprise and genuine respect in roughly equal measure. Park Seong-hwan wrote something in the session log. He did not read it aloud. Jae-Hyun looked at Baek. "The charter violation." "Yes," Baek said. "I know." We'll handle it through the standard review process, not as an emergency protocol. Jae-Hyun's voice was even. Given the disclosure, Beck nodded once, the nod of a man who has offered a thing and has had it received in the spirit it was intended. The session closed. The hallway outside was quiet. Most of the council members moved quickly toward the elevators, the way people move when a room has finished its work and there's nothing left to maintain. Youngjun fell into step beside Jae-Hyun for approximately 30 seconds, which was his way. Baek, Youngjun said, very low. I know. He's not going to be an ally, not formally, but he's not going to be an obstacle either. A pause. That's better than you had 48 hours ago. Yes. The two captains who were talking to Ryu. I've had conversations with both of them. They're uncomfortable, but they're not committed. Ryu is suspended, and he doesn't have a platform, and suspended men lose influence faster than they think they will. Youngjun glanced at him sideways. You're not stable, but you're more stable. More stable is enough for now. Youngjun stopped walking. He didn't extend a hand. He wasn't that kind of man. But he looked at Jae-Hyun with the particular expression of someone who has watched a person do something genuinely difficult and has enough respect not to diminish it with easy words. The Cheongwon channel, he said. If Beck's proposal holds, even at a fraction of the original value, that changes the financial picture considerably. I know. It also means the woman was right about what was at stake. A pause. What it tells your people about who you are. He said nothing else and kept walking. Jae-Hyun stood in the corridor for a moment. Outside the glass, Seoul was doing its morning thing, gray and overcast, the kind of October sky that looked like it had been pressed down from somewhere, close and heavy. Rain coming, probably. He'd learned to read Seoul's weather in the instinctive way you learn a city when you've lived in it long enough, not consciously, just absorbed. He pulled out his phone. He sent a message to Amara. Ratification passed. 8-4. He put the phone back. He had a full day ahead of him. The financial team, the secondary contract conversations, the Ryu review proceedings, a stack of operational decisions that had been deferred while the past week consumed everything. He had the particular accumulated fatigue of someone who had not slept properly in 6 days and who had spent that time making decisions that would take months to fully understand. He had all of that. He went to work. The ninth floor noticed the ratification before the formal announcement. This was the nature of organizations. Information moves through them in advance of its official form, carried in the spaces between things, in the way a manager's expression changed when they came back from a meeting, in the specific quality of silence that follows a decision before anyone's been told what the decision was. By 10:30, there were people on the ninth floor who knew. By 11, most of the floor knew. Not the details, not the 43 pages, not the council vote count, not the Chungwon withdrawal or Beck's independent channel or Ryu's suspension. Just the shape of it. That something had changed, that the reform package was real, that it had passed. Park Hyun-soo came to Amara's office at 11:15 and he knocked, which he didn't always do, and he sat down across from her desk and he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been running a calculation for a week and has just reached the sum. You went to the council chamber, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That was either the most courageous thing I've seen in 11 years with this company, he said, or the most reckless. My boss said the same thing. Park blinked. Then something shifted in his face that was very close to a smile. And you told him it was both. I told him it was definitely both. He looked at his hands. He was a careful man. She'd thought that since the beginning. And his caution was not timidity. It was the caution of someone who understood how things worked and had made a long peace with operating inside that understanding. He had told her to go home a dozen times. He had not pushed when she didn't. He had not pushed because he understood, better than she did at the time, what the culture in this building asked of people and what it cost them. The reforms are real, he said. Not just paper. The compliance review structure has teeth. He paused. And there's a whistleblower system. I know. If anyone on this floor does what was done to you, the message, the threat, they won't survive it. She held his gaze. Good. He nodded, stood up. Then he stopped. in the doorway, with the particular quality of a man who has been meaning to say something for a while and has decided now is the time. "When you came in that first week," he said, "and you walked into the glass door." She felt the old flinch and overrode it. "Yes. I almost said something to the people who were laughing." His voice was measured. "I didn't. I told myself it was minor, that you'd find your feet." He paused. "I should have said something." She looked at him. "I'm saying it now," he said. "Late, but I'm saying it." He left. She sat with that for a long moment. The office was the same office it had been for 7 months. The same desk, the same flickering free overhead light that had been fixed 2 days after she came back from the hospital. The same view of the inner courtyard where the junior staff ate their lunches when the weather was good. It was the same room. She was different in it. She wasn't entirely sure yet what that meant. She opened her work queue and started on the filing. The Cheongwan negotiations resumed 3 weeks later. Bayek had held the channel open, as he'd said, and the primary family representative, a man named Cheong Woo-sung, who had been in the distribution business for 30 years and who had not survived that long by being either purely principled or purely mercenary, had agreed to a preliminary conversation about the modified terms. Jae-Hyun attended the meeting himself, which was the right signal. Bayek attended as the man who had opened the channel, which was also the right signal. Young-Jun was present as the council's neutral observer, which was both functionally useful and politically meaningful. The meeting took 4 hours. The modified alliance was agreed at roughly 40% of the original financial value, with all reform protocols explicitly preserved in the contract language. Cheong Woo-sung had insisted on one addition, a clause stipulating that the reform protocols applied to joint operational arrangements, as well as Baeko's internal structure. Jae-Hyun had agreed to that clause without negotiating it. Cheong had looked at him when he agreed with the expression of someone who had expected negotiation and had not received it and had to recalibrate. "You're not going to push back on the joint clause," Cheong said. It was not quite a question. "No." "Why?" "Because it's the right clause." Cheong studied him for a moment with the flat, assessing look of a man who has spent 30 years determining whether the person across from him was telling the truth. "My people have been talking about you," he said finally, "for the past 3 weeks, about the emergency review, the council vote, the withdrawal." A pause. "About the woman who walked into our negotiating room and apparently changed the arithmetic." "She didn't walk into your negotiating room. She walked into the room that controls the people who walked into ours." Cheong's expression was unreadable, but not unkind. "Same thing, functionally." He looked at the signed document on the table between them. "Tell me something honestly." "If I can." "Was it worth it?" Jae-Hyun looked at the contract, at the number that was 40% of what it should have been, at the clause that would require him to extend the reform protocols beyond his own organization and into joint arrangements, which would take years to implement properly and would create friction in every shared operation for at least the first 12 months. "Ask me in a year," he said, for the second time. Cheong looked at him for a long moment. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. "I'll do that," he said. Ryu's formal review concluded in November. The findings were not disputed. The charter violations were documented. The sequence of events was clear. The coordination with council members before the emergency vote was established. The governing council voted to formally remove his captaincy, effective immediately. He was offered a severance structure that was fair and that he accepted without contesting, because contesting it would have required him to dispute facts that were not disputable. He did not speak to Jae-Hyun in the course of the review process. He communicated through his designated representative, and he was composed throughout, in the way people are composed when they have accepted something they cannot change. On his last day in the building, he passed Jae-Hyun in the corridor on the 23rd floor. It was not arranged, just the coincidence of 2 people in a building, intersecting. Ryu stopped. Jae-Hyun stopped. They looked at each other. 19 years of history in a corridor, not quite fitting into the moment they were standing in. "I wasn't wrong about the alliance," Ryu said. His voice was the voice of a man who has had weeks to organize what he wants to say and has chosen precision over heat. "The financial risk was real. The political exposure was real. I was not wrong about those things." No, Jae-Hyun said. You weren't. A pause. I was wrong about the approach. It cost him. Jae-Hyun could see it cost him. Not in a dramatic way, just in the small compression of his jaw, the single controlled breath. The organization, Ryu said, whatever you're building now, with the reforms, the welfare systems, I hope it works. He paused. I mean that. I know you do, Jae-Hyun said. Ryu nodded once, walked past him, did not look back. Jae-Hyun stood in the corridor for a moment after he was gone, and he thought about 19 years and the things they accumulate between two people and the specific weight of a loss that isn't clean. Then he moved. He had work to do. December came to Seoul the way December does. Abrupt, gray, the city shifting its rhythm into something slightly more interior and bright, with the particular manufactured warmth of a place that has decided to commit to the season. The Baiko Tower lobby put up the kind of tasteful, minimal decorations that expensive organizations favor. And the ninth-floor kitchen started accumulating the homemade food that people brought in when the weather dropped. The small, instinctive communal gestures of people who were beginning, slowly, to understand that the building they worked in was trying to become a different kind of place. It was not a fast transformation. Culture is never fast. The 43 pages of reform policy had been distributed and the compliance structures were in place, and the management evaluation frameworks had been introduced in a series of floor-level meetings that had been, in some cases, deeply uncomfortable. Managers who had spent years equating employee sacrifice with loyalty were being asked to relearn the metrics of their own worth, and some of them did not find this easy or welcome. There were departments where the new protocols were followed to the letter, and the spirit behind the letter hadn't changed at all. And there were departments where something genuine was shifting, slowly, like ground after a long rain. The anonymous feedback system received 47 submissions in its first month. 31 of them identified conditions that required follow-up. Jin-Suk reviewed every one personally, as Jae-Hyun had requested, and the follow-up actions were documented and communicated back to the submitters, which was itself the thing that mattered most. Not just the collection of feedback, but the evidence that it had been received. 2 managers were placed on formal performance review for conduct that the new frameworks identified as hostile. One of them resigned. The other completed the review process, changed specific behaviors, and remained with the organization. That second outcome was, in Jae-Hyun's read, the more important one. It meant the framework had teeth and also mercy, which was the only combination that made lasting change rather than just turnover. Amara's follow-up appointment with Dr. Song was in December, 3 months after the archive room. She was fine, her blood work was normal, her weight was stable. She had been eating regular meals. Not perfectly, not every day, but consistently enough that Dr. Song moved from the professional wariness of a physician monitoring a patient who might backslide to the more relaxed engagement of someone who has confirmed that the recovery is real. Your stress levels, Dr. Song said, looking at the results. Lower than I expected. Things changed at work, Amara said. Significantly, apparently. Dr. Song made a note. What changed? Amara considered how to answer that. The full answer was 43 pages and a council vote, and a suspended captain and a reduced alliance, and a woman who had stood in a restricted corridor and said she wanted to be heard, and had been, against all reasonable expectation, heard. The organization decided people mattered more than their productivity, she said, or decided to try to. They're still working on the trying. Dr. Song looked up from her notes. That's rare. Yes. How does it feel? Amara thought about it, genuinely, not reflexively. Weird, she said. Still a little weird. I keep waiting for the other shoe, for someone to tell me it was temporary, or that the numbers changed and the reforms are on hold. She paused. But every time I think that, I think about the fact that it costs something real. Not just policy language, actual money, actual relationships, and that makes it harder to dismiss. Dr. Song nodded. She closed the file. Come back in 6 months, she said, and eat breakfast. I eat breakfast. Every day. A pause. Most days. Every day, Ms. Bennett. She left the clinic and stood on the Seoul sidewalk in December air that was cold enough to bite, and she looked at the city for a moment. The way it moved, the way it always moved. Indifferent and vast and threaded through with 10 million lives. and she thought about the woman she'd been 7 months ago, standing in the lobby of Baeko Corporation on her first day, looking up at the tower and thinking that the only way to survive here was to make herself indispensable through total sacrifice. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity and not quite fondness, something older than both. She pulled her coat tighter and headed back to the office. She found out 3 weeks before Christmas that she was being promoted. Not effusively, not with ceremony, a meeting with Park Hyun-soo and an HR representative, a document, a revised job description, a salary adjustment that was significant enough to matter, and that Park communicated with the particular understated delivery he used for information he was quietly proud of. Senior Administrative Coordinator. It came with a slightly larger office and direct oversight of 2 junior staff members and a seat in the monthly department head meetings, which meant a seat at a table she had previously only entered to take notes. She looked at the document for a moment. "Is this because of what happened?" she said. She needed to ask it. Park didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Your performance record supports it independently," he said. "Your efficiency metrics are strong, your language scores are excellent, and your institutional knowledge after 7 months is above what we see in most employees at your tenure level." A pause. The circumstances of the past few months also accelerated a review that would have happened eventually. Both things are true. She looked at the document again, at the title, at the number. "I'll take it," she said. Park looked like he'd been expecting that with about 95% certainty and was nonetheless relieved by the confirmation. "One condition," Amara said. He raised an eyebrow. "The 2 junior staff I'm overseeing, I want to have a conversation with them in my first week about hours, about what's actually expected versus what the culture has historically rewarded. I want to be the person who tells them directly, not in a policy document, in a real conversation, that working until they collapse is not what this organization needs from them." Park looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a condition," he said. "That's just the job." She nodded. She went back to her desk. The last working day before the holiday break was a Friday. The building had the particular loose, relieved energy of a place unwinding, people leaving a little early, the kitchen table carrying more homemade food than usual, conversations in the corridor that ran longer than they strictly needed to. The 9th floor, which had spent the better part of the past year under various forms of institutional pressure, had the specific quality of a space where people had decided, collectively, and without quite saying so, to exhale. Amara stayed until 5:30, not because she had to, not because she was afraid of what leaving on time would cost her. She stayed because she had a thing she needed to do, and she wanted the floor to be quiet when she did it. She went to the kitchen and retrieved the container she'd stored in the back of the refrigerator that morning. It was a flat plastic container, the kind with the snap-lock lid, and it held the chicken soup she'd made the night before, the one her grandmother had made, the Atlanta recipe, heavy on the lemon and light on the salt, and with the kind of wide egg noodles that needed longer to cook than the recipe said. She took the elevator to the 42nd floor. Jin-suk was at his desk outside the executive office, which meant Jae-Hyun was in. Jin-suk looked at her, then at the container, then back at her, with an expression that was neutral and also somehow completely comprehending. "He has a call until 6, Jin-suk said. "I'll just leave this." He nodded and opened the office door for her. She went in. The executive office was quieter than she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. She had only been in it twice, both times for administrative purposes, and both times the room had had the charged quality of a space actively in use. Now it was late afternoon, and the sole sky through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the deep blue of early winter dusk, and Jae-Hyun was at his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his phone at his ear, and he looked up when she came in. He held up one finger. She set the container on the edge of his desk and stepped back. He was still on the call. Something about the Hansen secondary contract from the fragments she could hear. And he was looking at the container while he talked, with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that surprised him, which was not expressive but was complete. The call ended. He looked at the container, then at her. "Chicken soup," she said. "It's the Atlanta recipe, my grandmother's. Heavy on the lemon." He said nothing for a moment. He picked up the container and turned it once in his hands, the way people handle things that have been made for them specifically, that carry the weight of intentionality. You made this, he said. Last night, she paused. You mentioned, in the hospital, that your mother used to make soup when you were sick, and that you didn't remember the last time someone had. He was very still. I thought about that, she said. A lot, actually. She looked at the windows, at the soul dusk, because looking directly at him while saying this was more than she could manage. You sat on the floor of an archive room at midnight with me. You stayed until the medics came. You arranged the private room and you told the nurses I wasn't to be discharged until I was cleared, and you drove across the city because I called you from the floor and you came without making me feel like that was a burden. She stopped, started again. And I know you would say that was function, that it was what the situation required. But it wasn't. I've worked enough jobs to know the difference between obligation and a person who actually sees you. She looked back at him. You saw me, and I needed someone to see me for a long time before that night. The office was very quiet. Jae-Hyun set the container down carefully on the desk. He looked at it for a moment, and whatever was moving through his face was not the controlled professional neutrality she'd grown accustomed to reading. It was something underneath that, something that had less management and more exposure. I see you clearly enough to know, he said, his voice lower than usual, that you're going to be one of the best people in this organization in 3 years, maybe 2. She looked at him. Not because of what happened in October, he said, because of what you did afterward. The council chamber. The message you received and handled yourself before I knew about it. The promotion that you took and immediately asked to use to protect 2 people below you. He paused. That's not a person who needed to be rescued. That's a person who needed a system that didn't punish them for being human. She absorbed that. Thank you, she said, for building one. He shook his head, a small movement. It's 43 pages and a compliance review structure. It's not finished. It might not work the way I intend it to work. Culture is slow and people are complicated. And I've been in this organization 11 years, and I'm still figuring out the parts I got wrong. He looked at the container again. But it's built. And it has teeth. It has teeth, she agreed. A pause. The particular pause of 2 people who have said the important things and are finding the edges of what comes after. You're going home for the holidays, he said. It was the question a person asks when they want to know if someone has a place to go, and they're trying to ask it without asking it directly. Atlanta, she said. First time since I moved. My mother she's very ready to see me. Good, he said. And he meant it, simply, in the way simple things land after complicated ones. She moved toward the door. Amara. She stopped. He was looking at her with the directness that had unnerved her in the hospital, the quality of complete attention, but it was different now. It was the attention of someone who has sorted through a complicated situation and arrived at clarity, not someone in the middle of assessing. The promotion, he said, it's deserved, independently. Park's assessment was accurate. I want you to know that. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I know it is. A pause. Then she smiled. It was not the careful, deflecting smile she'd been using for 7 months. The one she deployed when she wanted people not to look too closely. It was the real one. The one from before the exhaustion had worn it down. And it changed her face entirely. Eat the soup while it's warm, she said. The noodles go soft if you wait. She left. She passed Jin-Suk in the outer office, and he said, without looking up from his desk, Safe travels, Miss Bennett. Thank you, Jin-Suk. She paused. Take a real break. However many days you have, take them. He did look up then, very briefly. Something moved in his expression, the specific micro-adjustment she'd learned to read as the Jin-Suk equivalent of being genuinely touched. I have 4 days, he said. Take all 4. She took the elevator down. The lobby of Baiko Tower at 5:50 on the last Friday before the holiday break was a river of people going home on time. This was not what it had looked like a year ago, or 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago. The lobby at 5:50 used to be quiet, the early leavers gone an hour before, the late majority still at their desks, the long stayers not even at the halfway point of their evening. Now it was full, genuinely full, with the particular loosened energy of people who had been given permission, formally and repeatedly, and with structural enforcement, to stop at the end of the day. It was not perfect. There were still floors where the culture was slower to shift, still managers who conflated presence with performance, still employees who arrived early because the anxiety of not arriving early was harder to manage than the cost of arriving early. Culture doesn't change in 3 months. It barely changes in 3 years. It changes in the accumulated small moments of 1,000 people making different choices because the choices are available to make. But the lobby at 550 was full. And that was something. Amara stood in it for a moment, in the middle of the moving crowd, her bag over one shoulder and the empty container in her hand. She'd forgotten to leave it, and now she'd carry it home and wash it and bring it back, and that was fine. That was a normal thing, a completely ordinary domestic inconvenience. And she felt, moving around her, the particular warmth of a building that was trying. That was what it felt like, she thought. Not transformation, not resolution, trying. She moved with the crowd toward the exit. Outside, Seoul in December was cold and bright and absolutely merciless in its scale, the kind of city that could absorb anything and keep moving, that would be here long after every person currently crossing this lobby was gone. She had been afraid of it when she arrived. She had felt, for months, the particular loneliness of a person trying to survive inside something too large to fully comprehend. She did not feel that now. She felt instead the specific and imperfect belonging of someone who had found the edge of the thing she was afraid of and had walked toward it, badly and messily, and with her arms around her own midsection, and had come out the other side still standing. Not triumphant, just standing. That was enough. 42 floors up, Kang Jae-Hyun was eating chicken soup at his desk. It was good. The lemon was strong and the noodles were wide and soft, and it tasted like something that had been made by a person for a person, which was the quality that distinguished it from the expensive, precisely calibrated meals that Jin Suk usually arranged. It tasted like someone had thought of him specifically when they made it. Not the boss, not the executive, not the man in the chair who had spent the past 2 months making decisions that cost more than he'd expected and yielded things he was still learning how to measure. Just him. He ate slowly, which he almost never did. He looked at Seoul through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city in the early dark of December, lit from within, moving in every direction, indifferent in the way only very old and very large things are indifferent. Not hostile, just complete, just entirely occupied with its own ongoing enormity. He had survived the vote. He had lost the original alliance and rebuilt a fraction of it on different terms, terms he could stand behind, terms that would require work for years to honor properly. He had lost his engagement to a woman he had respected and had not, he understood now, loved in the full way that deserved that word. He had suspended a captain he'd worked with for 19 years and watched him leave the building. He had ratified 43 pages of organizational policy that would take the better part of a decade to fully embed. He had not solved anything. He had started something. There was a difference. He ate the last of the soup and set the container aside, and he looked at the city and he thought about a phone call at 11:47 on a rainy Wednesday, a voice that came out smaller than intended, an apology attached to a question that had not actually been a weakness at all, that had been, in the way he now understood these things, an act of extraordinary courage from a person who had run out of other options. "Boss, could you please come get me?" And he had come. And the coming had changed things he had not known needed changing. He did not think of himself as a different man. He was not given to those kinds of narratives about himself. He was the same man who had built the same organization through the same combination of precision and will, the same man who had sat in rooms with dangerous people and made decisions about complicated things. He was that man. He was also a man who now ate soup made by someone who had thought of him specifically when they made it, who had a building full of people going home on time, who had a 43-page document with teeth and a compliance review structure and an anonymous feedback system that had already changed 2 situations that would previously have been absorbed silently into the institution's cost of doing business. He was that man too. He pushed back from his desk. He rolled down his sleeves. He put on his jacket, and he picked up his phone and he walked to the elevator and he went home. He left at 6:15. It was the earliest he had left on a workday in 11 years, and the building, for once, was quiet enough in the right way to notice.